Hi, everyone. Welcome to Thanks for Sharing. I am your host, Jackie Pack, and today I want to talk about emotional affairs on the podcast. So, one of the reasons I want to talk about this is often with clients that work with me or maybe work with one of the other therapists at our clinic, Healing Paths, what we find is if they have only had an emotional affair, often they downplay the seriousness of having an emotional affair. And so I want to just talk about that. I want to break that apart and get some understanding about why emotional affairs can be as damaging as sexual affairs. We know, like from research, that emotional affairs can wreak havoc on your marriage or long-term relationships, as well as on your family. You can only have a certain amount of emotional energy every day. And if you're focusing your energy elsewhere, it can start to have a detrimental effect on the relationships you have with the people who are closest to you, or we should say the people who should be closest to you. What's more, opening yourself up so much to another person always has the potential to turn into something more. So what starts as an emotional affair may not stay an emotional affair. Sometimes that does happen, but sometimes it crosses other boundaries as well, especially if it's someone you're attracted to or who fits a type that you might typically be attracted to if you weren't in a relationship already. Now, I want to be clear, friendships are fine, and friendships with the opposite sex, I've said this before, I've said this with Rachel in different podcast episodes. I think we should be able to have platonic relationships with people of the opposite gender of us. Now, I think it takes some work to be able to do that. And I don't know that our society teaches or models that very well, but I think it is possible. But I think it's also important to recognize when things may be starting to cross the line. And there are a number of behaviors or signs that can point to you or your partner having an emotional affair. So let me just define emotional affair really quickly. An emotional affair is a non-sexual relationship that involves a similar level of emotional intimacy and bonding that you would find in a romantic sexual relationship. Emotional affairs usually begin as friendships. And like I said, some platonic relationships can slowly morph into deep emotional friendships. When you find this other person attractive or when you share sexual chemistry, there might be a slippery slope pulling you away from your marriage or your partnership. Often there is no intention for these bonds to become anything more than just a friendship. But we have to keep in mind when we are friends with the opposite sex that the line is thin between close, meaningful friendships and emotional affairs. Emotional affairs can also quickly lead to flirtation and sexual encounters. A meaningful emotional connection is important for the foundation of any relationship, whether that's platonic or romantic. And so we have to understand that a friendship can evolve into an emotional affair when the boundaries begin to blur. So let me just give some stats about emotional affairs. So what is the prevalence of emotional affairs? According to the American Association of Marriage and Family Therapy, 35% of wives and 45% of husbands have reported having emotional affairs. However, one study found that 78.6% of men and 91.6% of women admitted to having an emotional affair. Emotional affairs can last for a few weeks, they can last for several months, or they can even last for years. Some say that emotional affairs are just as devastating to relationships as sexual affairs are. And sometimes people think that they are even worse because they involve strong feelings and a sense of connection and attachment. However, other research shows that people generally find sexual infidelity more troubling than emotional infidelity. We know sometimes this breaks down into gender differences. One study found that women are more upset by emotional infidelity than men, with 73% of women saying they would be very upset, compared to 56% of men. However, another study found that more females choose emotional infidelity than males, with 77.7% of females choosing emotional infidelity, compared to 64.6% of males. So again, we have to look at these different studies. On the low end, they reported 35% of wives, 45% of husbands reported emotional affairs, which put the husbands having, or men having, a higher percentage of emotional affairs. With another study putting 78.6% of men, 91.6% of women admitting to having an emotional affair. And then another study saying that 77.7% of females chose emotional infidelity compared to 64.6% of males. So again, the numbers vary according to different research studies. And again, the numbers vary based on self-report and what somebody is reporting in that moment. So what are some signs that either your partner is having an emotional affair, or for you, the line has been blurred and you've crossed into an emotional affair? Emotional affairs are usually characterized by a great deal of contact with one another. So when we're seeing frequent contact, this includes spending time together in person, having frequent contact when you're not together, texting. That's a sign. Sometimes that might be part of your job, that something's going on at work and it requires texting outside of work. But with emotional affairs, the texting typically outside, or the frequent contact outside of the office, usually is not around work. So, for example, you might communicate with this person at questionable hours. You might spend a lot of time texting, emailing, video calling, sending Marco Polos. And this is going to lead to neglect of your partner, your family, and other obligations that you have in order to maintain constant contact with this person. Neglect, especially, turns this kind of behavior from a close friendship into a cause for concern. Sometimes, we just have to ask, what if, or how might you feel if your partner spent your dinner date or movie night texting someone else throughout the whole date night? Another sign that we might see in emotional affairs is frequent sharing. So emotional affairs are also characterized by a tendency to prioritize this other relationship to the point where you are confiding in them more than you do your own partner. They may become the first person you want to call with any news, whether that's positive news or negative news. For example, if you have something exciting to share, or maybe you've had a particularly bad day, they are the person that you call or text. And what this means is you may not be sharing with your partner very much at all. Now, maybe you might not be intentionally hiding things from your partner, but the lack of communication means your partner doesn't really know what's going on in your life. And that's a signal that you are not prioritizing your primary relationship enough. Now, sometimes that may be that in sharing with this other person, you have gotten it off your chest. You've been able to talk with them. You've been able to share with them. You've been able to maybe be comforted by them or encouraged by them or celebrated with them. And those emotional needs have been met. And you don't have the same level of emotional needs if you're sharing that with your partner or when you're sharing that with your partner, because you've already done that with another person. The other thing I think that's important to think about is, or the other thing that can signal there may be an emotional affair happening is constant thoughts. So in emotional affairs, this other person becomes the focus of your attention. This person takes over your thoughts. You may also find that you're having a difficult time concentrating on things that don't involve this person. You're thinking about this friend constantly. They may be on your mind when you wake up in the morning. They may be on your mind when you go to sleep at night. And they often are on your mind a lot of time in between. You may have this person in mind when you're getting dressed for the day, hoping they're going to notice your appearance or comment on your appearance. So while emotional affairs, when we're talking about emotional affairs, they are non-sexual, but they can easily cross into romantic or sexual fantasies about this other person because of that close connection. Another sign that you may be involved in an emotional affair is you believe this person really gets you in a way even your partner doesn't. You might feel they have a lot in common with you. You have a lot of shared interests. Now, sure, this might sound like a typical close relationship, and it certainly can be just that. But if you feel this connection makes you resent your partner or starts to deteriorate the intimacy, connection, and communication with your partner, it's probably time to reassess your behavior. There's no one sign that indicates you're definitely having an emotional affair. Rather, it's a collection of your feelings and behaviors towards this person and the impact on your primary relationship. Another sign is inappropriate sharing. Emotional affairs might begin with conversations about work and other topics, but they often shift into more intimate details about your life, about your relationship, about your family of origin, personal issues, and can even evolve into conversations about your sex life. This tendency to make yourself emotionally vulnerable while disclosing intimate details about yourself and your feelings will deepen your attachment to this other person. You discuss very personal topics such as the problems in your current relationship, or you share all or most of your issues and concerns with this person. And as you do this, you may also grow more unhappy with your partner. You might see your partner in a more negative light, and you're not taking the steps necessary to repair the actual issues this is causing in your relationship. Which leads to another sign that you may be crossing those lines, blurring those lines, and that is unfair comparisons. As you grow closer to this other person, you can also begin to judge the others in your life, your partner, in comparison to this person. And again, we have to be mindful that this person is in a positive place in your mind. So you might compare them with your partner, even to the point of getting angry with your partner for not doing things that this other person does for you. Because you're idealizing this other person, your partner starts to look worse in your eyes. And you might find yourself being more critical of your partner or more resentful of your partner. It also means that you tend to look for mistakes and you overemphasize your partner's flaws without giving them credit for their strengths. These unfair comparisons can also mean that you overlook negative traits in the person you're having an emotional affair with. You might fall prey to the fallacy that the grass is always greener on the other side. Another sign is spending more time together. In addition to always being in touch with this other person, you spend much more time together in person. You might find excuses or create reasons to spend time with them. You might stay out together after work or make plans on the weekends with them. You might find excuses to avoid spending time with your partner so that you can spend more time with this other person. And you might get butterflies whenever the other person texts, calls, or visits. Another sign that underlies emotional affairs is secrecy. You start to lie, you start to be deceitful, and you start to keep secrets. Often this entails lying by omission, which is still lying, to be clear. Not only do you not mention your talks, your meetings, your lunches, your texts, and phone calls to your emotional affair partner, but you also take steps to hide these communications. For example, you might delete messages from your phone or deny the communication you had when you're asked. Or you might put this person's name under the gender that wouldn't be concerning to your partner. You hide things or you lie when you know deep down that this behavior is not okay. Would you be mortified if your partner heard a taped conversation between you or saw some of your spicier text conversations? If so, that's a sign that things have gone too far. Another sign is simply less time that you have available for your partner. Your partner is going to get less of you while this special person gets more of you. Whether it's less communication, less affection, you're not thinking about them, or they are not aware of your innermost world because you're not sharing that with them. Your time and focus are taken from your partner and they're transferred to this other person. Spending time with others outside your relationship and having emotional connections is not normally a problem if boundaries are in place and boundaries do not get blurred. It is when your connection with one person takes over your life, interferes with your relationship, and becomes something that you feel like you have to hide, then it becomes a problem. So one important question you should ask yourself: would you be upset if your partner was sharing this level of intimacy with one of their so-called friends? Now, what might your partner see when you're in an emotional affair? They might be seeing you spending less time at home, doing things without you, neglecting things around the house that are their responsibilities. They may be careful to hide their phone. They kind of act secretive about who they're communicating with online. They might change the passcode on their phone when previously you knew what their passcode was because they weren't hiding something. They might lock down their computer so that you can't have access to it. Your partner may constantly talk about this close work friend, this close friend, who they seem to share a special connection with, although they deny anything crossing lines when you ask about it. Another thing you might see is your partner starting to criticize you and comparing you to their friend. And then lastly, you will pick up that your partner seems to be withdrawing from you and is not sharing information about their life with you. Now, even when such affairs do not cross the line, by becoming physical and sexual, the impact can be just as damaging, and it can put your relationship in danger. The intimacy that's involved in emotional affairs can frequently have a degree of intensity that even is deeper than a sexual affair because the person is more emotionally invested. We know that emotional affairs can be just as damaging to a relationship as sexual affairs because they involve secrecy, they involve withholding, distancing, deception, and a redirection of emotional intimacy and energy away from the committed partner and toward the person that they're having this emotional affair with. Your partner may see this as the same level of betrayal as if you were in fact sleeping with the other person. And you don't get to tell them that it's very different. Some ways that emotional affairs can affect your relationship include a feeling of betrayal and hurt, damaging trust in the relationship, damaging relationship with other family members, including children. It can cause problems forming future relationships. It can lead to divorce. There can be feelings of guilt and shame that are expressed as anger. You may actually have a reduction in self-confidence. And like I said, the communication between you and your partner typically gets worse and the level of closeness deteriorates. Avoiding emotional affairs does not mean limiting contact with others or not sharing any emotional connections with your friends. Often, those relationships are essential for social support and our psychological well-being. But it is important to know yourself, to know what your boundaries are, and to know how good you are at maintaining the boundaries. One of the things that I often find is when there are some problems in the relationship, there's a tendency for emotional affairs to start, which means you're not focusing on repairing the problems in the relationship, and instead you're just taking this to another person. So what are some things that you can do if you feel like you're involved in an emotional affair? Number one, you have to create boundaries. You have to establish and maintain boundaries or expectations for how you and others get to behave in relationships. So let's give an example. Staying in contact with your friends can be essential, but there should also be certain times when the focus is on your partner and your family and your phone is not being a distraction. You're not checking to see what they're saying. Now, often if somebody has had an emotional affair and they come in and they're working with me or one of the therapists that I work with, often the first boundary that we put in place is we have to go no contact, at least for a certain time period. It gets difficult when the person works at the same place you work at, but we definitely have to limit the amount of contact and have very tight boundaries around the fact that all we talk about is work-related things. And usually there is a conversation about the fact that the boundaries have become blurred, that you're uncomfortable with the boundaries that you have crossed, and you're seeing the negative impact on your primary relationship and the impact on your family. Now, sometimes when I'm working with somebody, that's not actually how they're feeling. And so it takes, several sessions to get them to that place to recognize and hold accountability for themselves in order to see that they are negatively impacting the person they have claimed to love and commit their life to, as well as the children that they've created as part of that family relationship. The second step that I think has to be involved in pulling back from an emotional affair is there has to be communication with your partner. So yes, the partner has to know, you have to validate that yes, there has been an emotional affair, that you're recognizing that you're taking accountability for the damage that this has caused, that you want to work to repair the relationship, and that you are committed to talking to your partner about the details of your life, whether that's from the events of your day to your personal feelings about different events in your life. And usually there is going to have to be some accountability as to whether or not this person attempted to contact you, how you handled that. That's going to have to be reported to start to repair trust. Another step that's required when trying to make repairs from an emotional affair is starting to spend more time together as a family unit, spending more quality time with your partner. That can't just be sitting at a movie next to each other or sitting on the couch and watching Netflix next to each other. That has to include some active participation. And sometimes the couples that I work with, a partner may say, I never knew they could be so open emotionally. In our whole marriage, they've never been this emotionally open. And now I know that that's possible. And I expect that. I want that. And so there has to be some accountability and some understanding that if you haven't been emotionally sharing with your partner, if you haven't allowed your partner to emotionally share with you and you show up as a support person, then yeah, that's going to be expected of you. And you can't say that you don't know how to do that because you just showed them that you did know how to do that. The other thing that I often talk about, and again, for me, I'm working with clients who have problematic sexual behaviors that run the continuum. On one end, we might have sexual addiction. On the other end, or in the middle, we might have long-term emotional affairs, infidelity. And sometimes when I'm talking with people with sexual addiction, I notice this pattern. I'll bring it up to them and I'll point it out that on the one hand, one of the ways they're compartmentalizing their life is the people that they live with, they're not sexual with, or they're not emotional with in this situation. And the people that they don't live with get their emotional side, or maybe even get their sexual side. And again, that usually goes back to some family of origin issues, some attachment wounds, and some beliefs that if I let one person know all parts of me, that's not going to go well. And I shouldn't trust one person to know all of the different parts of me. And so that gets compartmentalized. And again, recovery is about living with the compartments open, living in alignment, and living with no secrecy. And then the last step that I usually set for people who I'm working with who have been involved in an emotional affair, or maybe they've been involved in several emotional affairs over the years, is building empathy for the impact this has on their partner and the relationship. So 1, building empathy. Number 2, taking accountability for whatever problems were happening in the relationship. They were exacerbated as you pulled away, started distancing, and started developing a closeness with somebody else. I've talked before on the podcast about how as human beings, we have attachment systems in our body. We also have threat systems in our body. And both of these often they work together in order to help us survive. So let's talk about our threat system. Our threat system operates in the background. It's running, humming along. We may not even be aware because it's just running at a low level and is scanning the environments for threats. And if it detects a threat, then it gets activated and dials up. One thing that I think is important to acknowledge is our threat system doesn't differentiate between emotional threats and physical threats. Now, sometimes with emotional affairs, we're not quite able to put our finger on the threat, but we will feel the threat, as the partner will feel the threat. And again, this is where some gaslighting might come in because they themselves aren't sure why they're feeling this threat, why they're reacting the way they're reacting. So let's take it back, a couple hundred years. And since I'm in Utah, let's say people are out hunting for food and this individual comes across a bear. Now the threat system is going to activate, it's going to dial up. This is where it goes into fight, flight, freeze, probably not appease because you're not going to make friends with the bear. So, again, this is where that sympathetic nervous system activates and our options are fight, flight, or freeze, plain dead. And often we don't even have time to make like a conscious decision. This is part of our limbic system, part of the brain that is reacting. And it's gathering data very quickly and assessing that and reacting. So we're not choosing to fight. We're not choosing to flee. We're not choosing to play dead or to freeze. And so let's say we do whatever our nervous system, our brain, our limbic part of the brain tells us is the best thing to do. And we get away from the bear. We survive. We make it back to our little community, our village. We make it back to our family. We tell them, oh my gosh, this is what happened when I was out hunting. And, our family's hugging us and telling us, I'm so glad you're safe. So glad you're back here. And so again, this is where our attachment system signifies to the threat system that the threat is over. I'm safe. I'm with the people who love me, who I love, and the threat has ended. And so then our threat system can go back to just kind of dialing down to a low level, scanning the environment, but not really being overly active. Now, two things about our threat system and our attachment system. It doesn't work well when the people we are attached to are also in our threat system. And when that happens, that's the repair that we have to make in the relationship. We have to get ourselves out of the threat system and back into the attachment system. And this takes time. It's not easy. And we're not going to do it by convincing somebody or speaking to somebody and rationalizing with them or justifying with them. Those things aren't going to work to move you back into an attachment system. What does work is how you show up. Showing up with accountability, showing up emotionally, being emotionally open, being willing to be vulnerable, and being willing to make repairs. Now, one thing I will often say to partners is, again, because this person that you are attached to has become part of your threat system, it's not always easy for you to determine where they're showing up. And you might be a little overreactive because, again, the incident with the person being out hunting and coming across a bear, that's what we would call a single incident threat or a single incident. I mean, maybe not trauma, but a single incident threat, let's go with. And when we have learned from young ages that the people in our attachment system are also in our threat system, and that's been normalized, that's going to make it difficult for us to understand that actually the people I'm attached to should not be in my threat system. But we might become, sensitive to that. And Again, I often will say humans are humans. That means they're imperfect. They're going to make mistakes. They might forget something. You might ask them, like, hey, on your way home from work, can you stop at the pharmacy and pick up some prescriptions? And they honestly forget to do that. And they pull in the driveway and they walk in the door without the prescriptions. And you react as though that's in the threat system. That's probably human error. It's probably some of that, like, we just get in the car after work and we end up at home and we forget that we actually wanted to stop on the way home. And so we have to have some space to recognize that there's still imperfection and that human imperfection is not a threat. And the person who has crossed from being in the attachment system into the threat system also has to recognize and be accountable in that moment and help their partner understand, hey, this is just human forgetfulness. This is just human behavior. I got in the car, I came home, I wasn't even remembering. I remembered when I was maybe packing up stuff to come home. And once I got in the car, I didn't even recognize that I was doing that. And I can understand why this feels triggering to you. I will go get the prescription. I want to make it up to you that what I say, I do, and that my words align with my actions, because I know I have repair work to do. That's what accountability might sound like. So I want to end with this quote by Michelle Mays. So Michelle Mays is a CSAT. She is out in Virginia. She works with partners. She works with addicts. I've had her on the podcast before as a guest. She has a book out that we use as part of our partner model that we're working with partners with betrayal trauma through. We don't start with this book, but it's maybe in the mid part of their recovery, called The Betrayal Bind. I think it's a great book. If you're not aware of that as a partner, I highly recommend getting that book, reading about that, reading what she has to write in that. And she also has, prior to writing books, she has 2 books out. She did a lot of blog posts, and her blogs are very informative. I often give blogs to partners as a resource for them. And because I've talked to Michelle before, I know that she says that the resources that are designed for partners, she feels totally comfortable with the partner who has betrayed also reading. That might help build some accountability, build some empathy, and vice versa. You know, if we're dealing with addiction, she also works with sexual addiction. And so sometimes that can be helpful for partners to read some of her blog posts that she writes for sexual addicts. So I want to end with a quote from one of her blog posts. She says, quote, "The other day someone asked, what is the worst case scenario for someone going through betrayal trauma? I'd never been asked this very interesting question, and I had to stop and think before answering. And the answer I came up with surprised me." And she talks about a few things. You can read that on the blog. I'm going to skip ahead because she's talking about that when we find ourselves in a situation where we are going through betrayal trauma, on the one hand, yes, we are kind of in the micro, the micro day in, day out interactions with the partner and with what's happening in our own nervous system. And that's going to happen. We can't just say, stop doing that or don't do that. Like, the way that our nervous system reacts when there is a betrayal trauma, that's going to happen. The other thing that helps us, though, is to get into some larger understanding, to create this larger context. And so she's talking about that larger context. And she says, quote, "That larger context was created by connection. Connection to myself, to my community of supportive and loving friends and family, and to God. My knowledge that the periods of defeat were temporary was based on my belief that everything I was going through was going to shape me and grow me into more of who I was created to be. The crappy, awful, mounting sense of betrayal and loss that I felt was not the truest story that was being told in my life. The truest story was the story of who I was and what it meant for me to live my life feeling connected to my most authentic and hopeful self, to others, and to my higher power. Allowing betrayal to create disconnection in our lives that separates us from ourselves, others, and God is the true worst case scenario. The only way to prevent this is to examine what our core beliefs are about the challenges and difficulties that life presents us with, and to stubbornly refuse to allow those circumstances to separate us from what we know to be true about ourselves, from the love of those closest to us, and from our higher power. And then she concludes by saying, "My hope for myself and for each of you is that we will find ways to remind ourselves of the truest story that is unfolding in our lives. We are loved, we are valued, we are here for a reason. That is what is true, and no amount of loss or betrayal can make it untrue."